Good morning, everyone. My name is Lin Zhao. I'm from ExxonMobil, and welcome to our oil spill response knowledge transfer webinar. Today, we invited the three experts who will talk about the wildlife response. And my colleague, Tim Nedved, will introduce our guest speaker in a minute. Before I turn to him, I have a few nuts and bolts needs to announce. So first, I have to say that the webinar will be recorded both audio by means of audio and video. And if you don't want to be recorded, you can submit your questions anonymously. And also, all our previous webinar recordings have been posted on the API website. I included the link in the meeting invite. You can check it out if you like. The webinar is a monthly webinar, and we intended to host the webinar every first Tuesday of the month at 10 a.m. to 11:15 Houston time. And as long as we can find suitable speakers and we have a good attendees, then we'll continue host the webinar. And we still have more room for more participants to join. So feel free to forward our invite to anybody who's interested. And for the format of the talks, we give the speakers about 1 hour to present, and then we leave 15 minutes for questions. If we have more questions, we'll continue answer those questions live. So based on previous experience, normally we can finish all the questions within half an hour. And the questions can only be input through the Q&A button. After the speakers give the talk, we'll go through these questions with the speakers. Now I will turn the floor to my colleague Tim to introduce the speaker.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. First up, I want to thank all the attendees for taking the time to come. I've said this many times in the previous talks, but I think this has been really valuable for Lynn and I, at least, and hopefully others. But it's allowed me to kind of get a lot of information and then capture it the way we're doing it with this recording and allow others to watch it if they weren't able to attend. So thanks for taking the time to come. And I also want to thank our speakers because Lynn and I are a bit of nervous Nellies about this thing, and we asked them to do a pre-trial run about a week ago, and then we have them come on early. So even if they're using canned slides that they presented before, we still take a bit of their time to get prepared for this. So I really appreciate the time that they take to make sure this is a high quality talk, and I'm expecting this to be a high quality talk. So this is a little bit different than what we've done in the last few months, but we have three world-renowned speakers who have a great understanding of wildlife response. I have some very nice bios sitting in front of me, but I didn't want to try to read through three bios and take a lot of time doing that. So I'm just going to kind of mention the names you can see on the slide. We have Dr. Michael Ziccardi, who's from UC Davis, Paul Kelway, who works for Oil Spill Response Limited, and Rich Davi, who works he's a colleague of mine working for ExxonMobil Biomedical Sciences. So I'm just going to give them that, and then these guys are going to give a little bit more introduction when they start their presentations. And so, as Lynn says, enjoy the talk, and then as the speakers, as questions come to you, put them up in the Q&A, and we'll go through them. And hopefully we've had a pretty good look getting through questions at all the questions that have been posted at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Ziccardi.
Great, thank you, Tim. Very happy to be here. As Tim said, the three of us are going to be giving an overview of wildlife response within the oil spill context. I will be starting it off with basically talking about the science of oil spill response, Paul Kelway will be following, talking about tiered preparedness and response, and Rich will be batting cleanup, talking about how wildlife response works within the IMS structure. So real briefly, for myself, I've been an oiled wildlife responder since 1996, responded to spills, number of different locations throughout the world. I've been the director of the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, which is a program that is co-managed by UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response. And our responsibilities are to respond to spills anywhere in the state of California if wildlife are at risk. The OWCN also participates both nationally and internationally in spill readiness and response as well. And I'm fortunate enough to be the chair of the Global Oil Wildlife Response System, which Paul will be touching on briefly later. But what we thought we would do within this session is to really start out with the science of oil wildlife response, how we apply best practices and research towards the preparedness that we use on a regular basis for spill response. But before we get into that research, we do need to have some background as far as how animals are affected during spills, how oil affects them in general. There's a whole host of ways that oil affects animals with a whole host of variabilities. So the product itself has different impacts, duration of exposure, if it's an acute exposure versus a more chronic, species and the age class, time of year and season, geographic location, weather and ocean conditions, the animal condition itself, whether it's healthy, whether it's ill or injured. Those are all things we really can't control. There are some things we can control and we can really focus on, those being speed of capture, available readiness, and available resources to respond to animals in crisis when spills occur. Now, these effects are in general categorized into two different types, external effects and internal effects. And so if you have been involved in oil spill response before, you do understand that usually the primary acute effect we're concerned about is due to the external coating of animals. So especially with birds and heavily furred marine mammals, they use either the feathers or the fur to maintain an air layer next to their skin. And it's that air layer that provides the insulation for them to survive in cold environments. What happens when oil goes onto the feathers or seeps down below the fur is it allows water to come in, causes a loss of buoyancy because those animals are taking on water. It also causes a loss of insulation, so that insulative air layer is completely gone, which causes hypothermia. So those two main things can cause decrease in foraging because animals cannot move around. They cannot function properly, especially in an aquatic environment, because they cannot eat. They are becoming very dehydrated. The ability to maintain normal body temperature is directly related to their metabolic rate. So for animals that already have a high metabolism, it actually kicks it up even farther. And if they have an inability to eat, getting dehydrated, and a requirement for an increased metabolism, you quickly have animals undergoing starvation, so loss of fat stores and muscle stores. So animals can die within matters of hours, even with a small amount of oil on them. Other external effects we see, depending on where the exposure is skin irritation or mucosa. You can actually have direct effects on the eyes. And because you have a break in that protective layer, you can be predisposed to bacterial infections. Now, internal effects are usually ones that we're more concerned of in a chronic manner. So either ingestion or inhalation of oil or oil type products, causing more chronic effects. Inhalants can actually cause direct damage to lung tissues, especially for highly volatile products. And so this is actually a photo of a sea otter that was affected during the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Those are actually lungs. They are not liver tissue. For those of you who are pathologists, they should be nice, foamy pink. They are not. That is basically blood consolidation within the lungs due to the direct effects of oil in that. Because the blood goes through the lungs and that allows it to go directly into the circulatory system, with lung damage, you can actually have a pathway to absorption, especially for smaller volatile organics as well. Post-Macondo, we've actually seen significant effects in coastal bottlenose dolphins, likely due to inhalant exposure in those species, which has caused a whole host of problems that we weren't aware of before as well. So those are data that are still being looked at, but definitely reproductive effects to the adrenal system, in addition to respiratory effects. Now, ingestion is another way animals can be exposed to oil, either ingestion of products through the water or through the food items themselves. And what has been seen is direct effects to the gastrointestinal system, so ulceration and bleeding. Actually, the physical coating of oil on the GI tract can actually cause the lack of absorption of nutrition and the absorption of fluids as well. So causing animals that are already having issues with nutrition and dehydration to go even further in debt. We can actually have direct effects to all the organ systems in the body if absorption of PAHs and other compounds occur. So direct effects to the nervous system, kidney, liver, adrenals, the direct effects on the blood. So the red blood cells, which allow animals to be oxygenated, can actually have direct effect on red blood cells and the lack of production of red cells as well, causing anemias. And we've also seen direct effects on white blood cells, causing a lack of ability of the immune system in animals as well. So as I said, the product type does have different effects on animals depending on the type. Heavier products were much more concerned about the physical coating on the animals, but we can see a contact dermatitis on the skin. You can also see higher ringed PAHs at higher levels in the heavier compounds. Of course, those aren't as absorbable in animals as compared to the single ring structures as well. But usually with increased volatility, we're more concerned about contact burns or the respiratory problems in there. So as we are considering wildlife response actions, we are directly looking at the product itself and the likely effects that that might have on animals. Now, going from that to the science, in the past 20 plus years, we've really tried as a profession to apply the best science possible to addressing the effects of oil on wildlife and how to mitigate those impacts. So we've looked at a whole host of different ways. The program I manage, the Oil Wildlife Care Network, we do have a research program that to date has funded hundreds of projects and actually allocated more than $4 million to look at how to better understand the effects of oil on wildlife and how to respond better. These are the 4 categories we use in our competitive grants process to determine which are the best projects to move forward and which are most likely to result in data that can actually be directly applied to our response and readiness activities. Now, what I'm going to do is to briefly go over a subset of projects that either have been funded through the OWCN or that we've been affiliated or associated with since 1996. But those that directly relate to tertiary response activities, as Rich will be talking about later. So the direct recovery, rehabilitation, and release of animals. First, for field operations, some of the things we've looked at is just how important rapid collection is in getting out there for survivability of animals. So we actually looked at data after the Casca-Busan spill, which it was in 2007 in the San Francisco Bay, actually putting regression analyses and survival analyses towards those data. And really what we found is that survival to release is absolutely correlated with rapid collection of animals. So getting out there, getting animals in care, directly relates to survivability. We've also started looking at field stabilization, providing early first aid to animals as early as possible prior to moving on to a primary care facility, really trying to get hydration, getting early heat therapy to animals immediately after collection on the beach if possible. We have a number of different projects right now that are going on. Currently, the data we have are qualitative and anecdotal, but Nancy Anderson from my team has been looking directly at testing those hypotheses, but then also looking at hydration status early and just how important that is for survivability. Now, moving from the field to the facility, some of the things we've been looking at is biomedical information. So looking at the actual veterinary care of animals. First is health assessment, looking at health parameters and how they relate to how can we best predict animals' survivability and progress during the rehabilitation process. So some of the things that we do collect and look at during every spill is how anemic and how high or low are the blood proteins that exist, because those are data that we can collect with a very small volume of blood collected from each animal. So we've looked at packed cell volume, which is the percent of the blood that is red cells, and blood proteins and body weight to see just how those are, how predictive those are of survival. And what we found is both PCV and body weight is directly related to survivability. What that has not only done for us in applying care, it's actually allowed us to apply more stringent triage criteria early on to try to reduce any humane issues that might occur. So if there is an animal that is very unlikely to survive to release, we can now more proactively, humanely euthanize those animals early, not only to reduce the suffering in those individual animals, but also to reserve the resources necessary that can be applied to animals that are likely to survive. Another thing we are looking at is acute phase proteins. So some of the blood proteins that are directly related to inflammation or other issues that the animals that might be occurring internally, and those things that we cannot detect. What we found is one of those acute phase proteins, fibrinogen, is directly relevant to, again, survivability after release in our post-release studies. Now, one of the issues that we address on a regular basis with seabirds in care is aspergillosis. That's a ubiquitous fungal organism that is everywhere. For seabirds that come in very evolved respiratory tract and very susceptible to this disease, especially those that are immunocompromised. We have had spills where we've had 25 to 50% of the animals that have had ASPR during those spills. So we spent a great deal amount of time and effort looking at diagnostic tests to see how to detect it and better treatment modalities to try to prevent it as well. And so those are studies that are ongoing. I apologize for the busyness of this slide, but there's been a lot of work in husbandry of animals once they're in care. We've looked at the importance of stress in these animals. Again, immunocompromised animals, stress can further reduce the immune systems. So looking at the effects of captivity versus oil is important to be able to do that. And one of the things we found, it's very inconsistent. We have an inability at this point to really look at the effects of oil directly versus the oil effects of captivity, which is a significant confounder for a lot of the work we do looking at oil effects. And we've looked at behavioral changes due to pen design and pool design. We've looked at the importance of minimizing stabilization time in facilities, moving them through the system as quickly as possible, but giving them some time, especially with birds, to get over the initial stress of being captured, being brought into a facility, giving them a tincture of time, if you will, with good nutrition, good hydration before we move them to cleaning. We've done excellent work. Dr. Doer at International Bird Rescue has done excellent work looking at different nutritive solutions instead of just giving them fish slurries or products that have been developed for domestic animals, actually applying better technologies to that, to look at how to get higher planes of nutrition in these animals, but then also the frequency. If we can give them a higher plane of nutrition, we can handle them less frequently, therefore decreasing the stress they're going on. Again, as far as husbandry, we've also looked very closely at pool and pen design to really look at trying to reduce any secondary problems that might be occurring in these animals. Worst thing we can have is an animal de-oiled, put into our pens, put into our pools, and have them succumb to injuries or decreases in health just simply due to the enclosure design. So spent a large amount of time on that. Last, really looking closely at de-oiling technologies, really looking at whether or not other methods, other products can de-oil animals better. So we've spent a great deal of time not only looking at the products to wash animals, but then also products to pre-treat animals. For animals that are very heavily tarred or oiled, sometimes it's best to apply a pre-treatment to emulsify the oil out of the feathers and the fur before then moving on to wash. We've found, and a lot of this work has been done by Tri-State Bird Rescue in Delaware, pre-treatment agents, looking at different liquid dishwashing detergents, looking at the optimal quality of the water itself, the hardness, the temperature, the pressure that is required for that. Interesting technologies being developed in Australia is the use of iron powder and magnetic technology to actually pre-treat animals prior to the wash. The ability to remove oil using iron filings. Initially, work that's been done by John Orbell and others in the South. As part of this, we've also looked very closely at waterproofing, looking at some of the feather structure effects as a post-Macondo results, actually looking very closely at chemical dispersants and whether chemical dispersants increase the impacts of oil in seabirds in that. And what we found was dispersant can act in a similar manner to oil in that it decreases waterproofing, but it's a very transient process. So within a day, that chemical dispersant can be gone. And actually, we've found that at least the external effects on birds is that chemically dispersed oil does not increase the negative effects of oil in those animals. We've also looked at surface tension and the effects in animals and the ability to detect problems in pools. This is a infrared picture of two seabirds in a pool. You can see the first bird actually has heat loss on the head of that animal compared to the one behind. That may indicate a lack of waterproofing in the head there. That animal may be one that we would want to take out and rewash because it has increased heat loss. So these are some of the things that we have been doing to look at it. And at least in California, we've actually taken those data and applied them to our protocols to improve how we do things and why we do things. And what we've actually seen is an increase in survivability to release over time, a statistically significant increase in survival, which we apply at least in part to the research that we've done and the application of those data to our evolving protocols. Now, one of the other larger questions that come up is, yes, you do great work. Yes, those animals can survive to release, but what happens with them after they leave your hands? Is there survival? Is there return to normal function? And do those animals that are oiled, rehabilitated, and released actually contribute to the population? Or are they, in strict ecological terms, just a waste of resources out there because they are not back to reproductive fitness? So there's been a whole host of post-release studies done in the past. The Sharp paper in 1995, it's probably the seminal work early on looking at this information. It's actually work that we funded through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and OWCN, looking at band returns in common MERS over time. And what Brian found was that the mean survival of those animals after rehabilitation or release was very, very poor, average of 9.6 days. Interesting information, but again, with band return data, some of the challenges that exist with that is that it's very low sample size, and you're also collecting data during and immediately after spills. So you have an increased search effort of those animals. So one of the things we wanted to do is to apply different technologies to see if that was actually the case, or whether or not some of those results were actually based on the type of post-release study that was done. So we followed that up through a spill in 1999 in Humboldt County, Northern California, where common MERS were affected. We actually used VHF radio transmitters, followed those animals over time with both an oiled and a rehabilitated, unoiled rehabilitated control group. What we found is that survivability was much better than those 9.8 days. We did see, however, that oiled rehabilitated animals were more likely to die, but that survivability was in the order of hundreds of days versus tens of days. And really that survivability was due to the early effects. So the effects in the first month, if animals could survive that first month, there was no statistically significant difference in survivability after that. So that is one of the things that then spurred us to actually look at that survivability in the first days and whether we could apply better triage methodology to get animals healthier prior to that release. Now, over time, we've also done a number of other post-release survival studies. We did this study after Casca Busan, looking at sea ducks after that spill. We actually applied a third group to this one. We had an oiled, rehabilitated, and released group. We actually had a rehabilitated and released group. So we took unoiled animals, washed them, and released them. And then we had a control group that we captured in the field, put radio transmitters in them, and then released them immediately so that we had a more equitable comparison group. This is also a group that we implanted radio transmitters in them instead of having them on the back to decrease issues related to aerodynamics or hydrodynamics in these species. What we did find is that there was some effects of oiled or rehabilitated animals in that they stayed closer to shore and their home range seemed to be a bit less. So there seems to be a bit of an issue related to oiled, rehabilitated, and released animals. But again, significantly better survivability than had been reported in the field. Now, the third study talking about is one that we've just finished analyzing the data on. This is following the Refugio oil spill in 2015 in Santa Barbara. This is work that we actually applied more advanced technologies to because the field has evolved, but also brown pelicans, which were the species that were at greatest risk during the spill, are larger birds, so we could put larger tags on them. So we actually used satellite-powered PTTs, so GPS tags, attached via a backpack to these species. We did 12 oiled and rehabilitated animals with 8 controls on this. What we found after this is all animals survived more than 12 weeks. We did see the distance that the animals traveled were statistically insignificant. However, the rehab animals seem to have traveled more and longer distances and really focused in on better waters, so better feeding areas versus those animals that were controls. But we do have animals because, again, using satellite technology, we were able to track very, very long distances over time. We also, because the solar technology, we've been able to follow them over greater amounts of time versus those that have batteries. And we're able to actually track them back to reproductive grounds in Baja California. What we saw is that both controls and oiled and rehabilitated animals did return to breeding grounds, The rehab animals did have a slight decrease in rate of return, but they did. And one of the issues with this study, even though the results were great, we did have some pretty significant transmitter failures. So at 40 weeks, we only had 3 rehab animals and 2 controls still transmitting. And we're still trying to tease apart those data to see if it was actual mortality in the animals or whether or not it was the tags themselves that stopped transmitting. So with all that research going on, how is this information applied to the oiled wildlife community? And really how it's applied is in the planning process, how including these data into the readiness capabilities as well as the response capabilities. And some of the things that we do outside of California is making sure that both the national and international planning takes these data into effect. And so within the global oil wildlife response system, which Paul Kelway will be touching on more in a few minutes, really applying those data to that to make sure that the protocols that are developed are based on the best available science. And so within this GOWRS project, there are a number of different deliverables that we have done since the project started in the early 2010s. One of the things that you'll see here, though, is our internationally agreed upon animal standards. And those are based directly on a lot of the results from the research that have been applied to the 10 organizations that make up the GOWRS system, pulling together the protocols, making sure that those protocols are based on the best science possible, and making sure that those are applied as far as international standards. So again, circling back to what impacts survival, we do look at this very closely, but again, those things that we can directly affect, the speed of capture, the available readiness, and the available resources, applying the best science possible to those things to increase survivability, increase the likelihood that animals are going to return to normal is absolutely necessary and absolutely one of the things that we want to do as professionals within this. And really thinking about what makes oiled wildlife response successful. Not only is it safely done, not only is it caring for animals that are in crisis, but returning normal wildlife to a clean environment and learning how to better respond in the future. Absolutely essential, which is essential why the best science possible is applied to it. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Paul. Paul?
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. So that was a great overview from Mike. I think really sets the scene and gives a sense of just how far we've come in terms of the field of oiled wildlife response. Just before I kick off and continue the story, just to briefly introduce myself. So I'm Paul Kelway. I'm the Wildlife Preparedness and Response Manager at Oil Spill Response Limited. So I'm based in the UK, and I've worked in the field of oiled wildlife preparedness and response since 2000. Previous to OSRL, I served as a Senior Technical Advisor for the Sea Alarm Foundation. OSRL and Sea Alarm have worked together for many years and was the project coordinator for the GOWRS project during that time. And prior to Sea Alarm, I had some experience in California as well and served as the Executive Director at International Bird Rescue for a time and also part of the advisory board for the Oiled Wildlife Care Network. I will really continue the story and just take a slightly different tack here in terms of looking not just at the technical developments, which Mike has covered, but also now looking at some of the developments in terms of tiered preparedness, specifically looking at an industry model of preparedness and how we can apply that and just really gauge where the world is currently in terms of preparedness levels. So a few things I'm hoping to touch on here. So tiered preparedness, the theory behind it, and also just the reality where we are and just some of the future work that's outstanding. I want to look at tier 3 or international response resources and the role that they play, and also finish off about talking about the process of developing in-country preparedness. And I think that will then set up nicely for Rich to go into a bit more detail about how preparedness and response work in practice.
So a lot of significant developments, as Mike was describing, in terms of the field of wildlife response. The reality in terms of the global picture is that still there's really only a handful of countries that have integrated preparedness systems to really support an effective wildlife response at the scale that Mike's talking about. And there's just a few examples here. So the US and notably California, which is the program that Mike manages, New Zealand, Brazil, Australia, the Netherlands, Finland. These are just a few examples of countries that have really taken a proactive approach. And I think it's fair to say that they tend to be, and not always, but there are these common characteristics that we'll see in many of these places. So often there may be regulatory requirements. Those requirements might require operators to have a wildlife response plan. And so certainly those plans will be in place. And often we'll see that there's some government or industry funded multi-year program that really works to support and maintain the capability to respond. And ultimately, in terms of delivering that capability, some consideration for how different wildlife response organizations would be integrated into that system. So again, not that all of these factors are in place, but often if one of these is not in place, then we might see that impacts the effectiveness of the system in question. But really, not knowing where the next incident is likely to occur, really, I think the key challenge, globally speaking, is the majority of countries still remain quite unprepared for a wildlife response at a large scale. Since its inception in '99, Sea Alarm as an organization have really dedicated themselves to exploring and improving that situation. So Sea Alarm are a non-governmental organization based in Brussels. And as I mentioned, Sea Alarm and OSRL have actually collaborated very closely for 17 years. We have a service contract that allows Sea Alarm to be available 24/7 to advise our members. But really, as part of that contract, that really enables and supports Sea Alarm in carrying out their mission to raise awareness and actually improve preparedness and response. And they do this in all sorts of ways. They've engaged government authorities, they've engaged industry, and they've helped to catalyze some of these really important projects like the GOWS project that Mike mentioned. And they've also developed all sorts of tools. There's a screen print here from their online database of wildlife response country profiles. Just some of the things that start to uncover a clearer picture of where we're at and how we can improve that preparedness going forward. So that relationship between Sea Alarm and OSRL, I think, has been a key driver in terms of the oil industry's recognition for wildlife response over the last nearly 2 decades or more. And I think on top of that, 2 major industry spills, the Montara, which happened off the coast of Australia, and Macondo, which Mike mentioned, also served as major catalysts for further integration of wildlife response as part of some of these efforts to review good practice following those incidents. There's a number of things that came out of those reviews of good practice. So one of them was the formal inclusion for the first time of wildlife response in a new industry tiered preparedness and response model. That's known as the TPR wheel down here in the bottom left. A new good practice guide that was published by IPCA. It was written by a consortium of wildlife response organizations. And also funding for this project that Mike mentioned, the Global Wildlife Response System, or GOWS project. And one of the legacies of that project is that this year that GOWS project is to become an actual live Tier 3 service available through OSRL, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Just to mention this model for those that aren't familiar with it, so the concept of tiered preparedness has been around for some time. Really the idea of cascading resources to where they're needed, when they're needed from further afield. And that industry model of tiered preparedness was reviewed and updated following those Montara and Macondo incidents as part of a joint industry oil spill response project. And that resulted in this model you'll see here, which is referred to as the TPR model, or TPR wheel. So that was published by IPCA as part of a new suite of good practice resources. And essentially it defines really and categorizes those tiers based on the location of the resources that are required to respond to an incident. So it's not about the size of the spill in terms of volume, it's really where those resources are located. So tier 1 being often those resources that are locally held by the operator for a spill at an operational facility. In certain situations, extra resources may be required, and those are likely to come from within the country, either regionally or nationally, and may be held by other third parties, and they really help to increase the capacity and perhaps introduce more specialist expertise as well. And then finally, tier 3 capabilities are then the globally available resources, and they further supplement those tier 1 and tier 2 capabilities when needed. So the resources that are held at all those tiers really should complement each other. So together they enhance the overall capability, and it's cumulative in nature. So the important concept here is that one tier does not replace the other. It really complements and supports the capability at that level. So the other thing about this model was the introduction of these 15 discrete capabilities. So recognizing that how you create that mix of capabilities across those 3 different locations is going to be different based on the specific response aspect in question. And I'm obviously going to talk a little bit about the wildlife response piece, and I'll use this model just to introduce and talk about the theory of preparedness for wildlife response. So significantly, old wildlife response was included as part of this new TPR wheel as one of these 15 capability requirements. And there are 2 freely available documents that were developed really to depict what that looks like in practice. So the first is a good practice guide on preparedness. So it's really about writing a plan and implementing that plan over time. So how to plan, how to prepare. And then the second, which is what Mike had mentioned, was really designed as a technical support document to that good practice guide, to describe really the underlying principles in wildlife response. Both of these documents were developed, as I said, by a consortium of wildlife response organizations, leading organizations in the field. So at the heart of the TPR wheel and really any effective response is a good incident management system, or IMS. Rich is going to come back to the wildlife branch in a bit more detail, but just to mention here, one of the keys to a successful wildlife response is really good integration with the incident management system. And the incident command system, which was developed in the US and has generally been adopted by the oil industry worldwide, is very much the standard. And in that system, the wildlife branch sits within the operations section. And that's responsible essentially for all of wildlife response operations. That being said, wildlife is also represented in the planning section through the environment unit, and the environment unit is very involved in supporting the development of the wildlife section of the incident action plan, and also making sure that there's good understanding and communication around the expectations and the needs of a wildlife response. And obviously to that end, logistics and finance are very involved as well in terms of making sure those resources are obtained and deployed. So while wildlife response organizations themselves will serve, I think, a lot of the workforce in that wildlife branch, it's really important from an operator's perspective that there's a good understanding of the needs of a wildlife response, and certainly some key individuals who would be trained and experienced to serve as a wildlife branch director, really helping to integrate and interface between the wildlife response experts and the specific incident management system in question. So as I said, Rich is going to go into this in more detail, but I think it's helpful to just lay this as a foundation. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, globally speaking, there are significant variables in the setups and incident management, and certainly that could provide challenges to a wildlife response. So in a unified system, such as in the US, all stakeholders and resources are integrated into one organizational structure. So obviously that really helps ensure there's a unified effort, but that's not always the case in every country, and the incident management system of a specific country may differ from that used by the responsible party for a particular incident. So this is something to be aware of, and what it means is the role of the or expectations on the responsible party in any given country may differ. So in some instances, the government may provide oversight, but they might look to the responsible party and its resources to really respond to the incident. In another situation, the RP may be required to step back They would provide the funding, but the government and its system would essentially play a lead role. And in either case, there's a question there about the presence of and the integration of wildlife response organizations. And that's not always the case. They're not always operationally integrated. And certainly any one of those situations might significantly challenge a wildlife response. And I think what it speaks to really is just the importance of pre-planning, the importance of really understanding how these different actors and resources are likely to come together, so that can be defined and built ahead of time. But it's certainly something to be very much aware of. So as we move from the center of the TPR wheel to the old wildlife wedge, we can also see that in reality, when we lift off the lid here, there's a variety of operational activities that we're having to consider and plan for. These are organized according to primary, secondary, and tertiary response, and they take place both in the field and also at the rehabilitation facility. Rich is going to go into these in a bit more detail, and they're also referenced in good amount of detail in that technical support document available through IPCA. And from a preparedness perspective, I think the main thing is it's critical to understand the operational implications and the requirements, the resource requirements of these various activities, obviously for them to be carried out effectively by trained and experienced personnel. And I think this is something I think globally speaking is hugely underestimated. It's obviously not enough, given the description that Mike went through to hand over a response to well-meaning but untrained volunteers, members of the public. This is very much a professional endeavor and obviously needs to be considered and planned for as such. So although this isn't to scale, the idea here was just to represent, hopefully in a bit more of a sort of realistic way, the composition of those three tiers of resources, how that mix is likely to look in a given country that's considered this. So if we look at tier one, so for an industry spill from an operational location, there may well be a need to have a small cache of equipment held by the operator locally, especially if it's a platform or a more remote operational area. And in some instances, that could just be reconnaissance, but it may also be basic capture and stabilization equipment if there are personnel trained to carry out those activities. In terms of tier two, so this is really where the bulk of the resources are coming from. So from wider within the country or region, very much likely to come from third-party resources, sources, and the resource requirements here are quite extensive and can be very much underestimated. So we're talking personnel, equipment and supplies, transportation, and facilities. And of course, those facilities need to support the animal care, but also the human workforce as well. And those facilities have very specific requirements, obviously, to combat some of the challenges that Mike alluded to. So obviously sufficient space, caging, ventilation, heating, power, water supply, a waste plan, etc. And here's just one example. This is a temporary facility that was set up following the Bojabile spill, which happened in the Netherlands a few years ago, but just one example of the kind of footprint of the type of operational resource requirements of an operation. And this was with about 500 oiled swans. And then tier three resources, I mean, we're talking about the international expertise, but also critical equipment. So that would include OSRL's services and equipment, and I'll come back to those shortly. And I think it's important to mention tier three here is not about the scale of the resources, but more about the technical expertise, the specialism, and that ability for those experts, that equipment to really serve as a force multiplier for the response. So this is the ideal makeup, but I think in many situations we may be unclear what in-country preparedness is actually there ahead of time. And this is where international experts can really play a fantastic role, not just in response, but also in preparedness, in helping to move that forward, really supporting that journey of in-country preparedness, being that force multiplier in those situations. And what it means really today is that, we're looking at a situation where we shouldn't assume that there are wildlife response plans in place. I think we're seeing a lot more progress on that front, but there's more work to do. We're also often looking at potentially limited in-country preparedness, in-country capability to respond. So some of the future priorities when we think globally is really firstly enhancing the international resources that can be available to support a response, and then really working to further implement in-country preparedness. So really building that journey in country of really getting in place those tier 1 and tier 2 capabilities. So in terms of tier 3 resources, so at the moment, OSRL members have access on a guaranteed level to 2 technical advisors from Sea Alarm to provide expert advice on old wildlife response. And one of those advisors can actually be mobilized on site. In addition to that, OSRL maintains 4 stockpiles of critical wildlife response equipment. So we hold those in our 4 surface response bases. And obviously it's not feasible to hold everything that would be required in a wildlife response, but these kits have been purposely put together based on input from leading wildlife response organizations to support those initial phases of a response in the field and in a facility, and hopefully bridge that gap where supply chains and resources may not have kicked in and be able to keep up with the response. So it really helps to make sure that those critical response activities can get going. And then later this year, the Gowers Assessment Team service will come online to complement that. And that is a guaranteed service to our members, essentially provided collectively by these 10 wildlife response organizations, really to offer and guarantee a 4-person assessment team that would be tailored for any specific incident, with these key roles that have been identified as really being able to make a difference in those early phases of a response. So an operations and planning specialist, a field and capture specialist, a rehabilitation and facilities specialist, and either a veterinarian or an incident specific specialist. So this Gowers assessment will essentially join the suite of wildlife services really as a complement to the technical advice from Sea Alarm and our wildlife response equipment. So looking at how this all would work in a response, so these tier 3 experts, if we go back to the incident management system organizational chart, so the idea here is that these tier 3 experts are integrating into that system to help support the development of the early phases of the incident action plan as we hopefully move into an operational response phase. So if you think about a country with limited preparedness, that these experts can really play a vital role. If I think of Sea Alarm, obviously making sure that all key stakeholders are incorporated and things are really working and moving towards an effective response. And in terms of the Gowers assessment team, is also conducting a field assessment to really complement the development of that incident action plan. So really assessing and determining what feasible response options might there be in a country where the preparedness is not optimal. If those recommendations are accepted, then of course there's an ability to move into a wider response. And at that stage, the tier 3 response may be contracted via one of the Gowers network partners. And they would obviously then serve as a lead role, a lead organization within the wildlife branch, perhaps bringing in more resources if needed. So that would be a picture of really how these resources would support a response. And importantly, the idea here is also that they would support preparedness. So as well as being there to be mobilized if an incident occurs, the idea here is hopefully to see these resources being mixed into exercises as well, really utilizing the expertise of these organizations to really support that ongoing development of tier 1 and tier 2 capability. And then finally, and Rich will go into a bit more detail with this as well, that in-country preparedness journey is really the next frontier for any country or region that is not at an optimal level of preparedness. And that IPCA good practice document really describes well the sequence of improving that preparedness over time. And that really is a multi-year journey. And that journey was further illustrated through a workshop that happened a few years ago. And this was a model that was developed by Sea Alarm and some of the industry stakeholders there, really to just show how this process builds on itself. So this preparedness wheel, as it's called, really emphasizes that it's not just about the initial assessment and the determining of objectives and planning for a response, all of the purple elements of this model. It's really also then about the implementation of that over time. So the effort to really make sure that that capability exists, it's trained and it's response ready. So investing in equipment, in trainings, in exercises, and of course learning and improving that system over time through exercises and also responses. So we're certainly hopeful that more operators and stakeholders will adopt this model over time. And as I said, Rich is going to speak a bit more about ways that this is being used in practice. But for my part, I think just to reiterate a few takeaways, I think it's just to recognize that it's important that wildlife response is seen as integral to oil spill preparedness and response as a whole. Certainly to recognize that, that it is complex. And I think historically that has been underestimated in some countries or regions. And so that complexity really requires in pre-investment, it requires that development in country preparedness through exercises and training, and certainly engaging all of the key stakeholders that need to be involved. And of course, international experts can play a really key role in supporting that journey. So with that, I will hand over to Rich just to, as I said, talk a bit more about how this looks in practice. So Rich, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. And to cover what Paul and Mike have said, before I do that, let me introduce myself. For those who don't know me, Rich Davi. I'm with ExxonMobil Biomedical Sciences. I've been with the company for about 35 years as a marine biologist and environmental scientist. Been involved in oil spill response since about 2010. I'm a wildlife lead on the regional response team. And I'm the chair of the wildlife community of practice that was a follow-up from the Gowers Industry Advisory Group. I work closely with Paul Kelway on that as well, and also Mike Ziccardi. My role here for this presentation is to tie Mike's and Paul's presentations together and then talk a little bit about the community of practice. But before I get into how preparedness works in all of this, I want to just talk briefly about where wildlife response fits into the incident management system. So as you can see, incident management is basically a glorified org chart, and there's sections and whatever. Typically, the wildlife branch falls under operations. ExxonMobil, because of, we understand that some of the complexities of all of this, and as you saw from Mike's and Paul's presentations, there's a lot of work that goes into a wildlife response. So we have opted to put a wildlife expert within the environmental unit, and that's pretty important because that's where a lot of the, or all of the environmental experts are housed in a response. So even though there is, the wildlife branch in operations, is a very clear connection with the planning group and the environmental unit leader. Because in order to have an effective wildlife response plan, you need all the cooperation of the stakeholders. The stakeholders, in many cases, are government agencies. There may be some NGOs that are a part of this. The oil wildlife response experts are involved, and any other competent authorities that sit within the environmental unit. It's important to have their input into your plan so that it makes it easier for that plan to be accepted, moved along, and achieve a good response. Because a well-designed plan is going to, provide the direction to achieve that effect. So what we do is we put that plan together, and then we pass it on to the operations team to work the plan. Why do we want to work the plan? Because we want to have the best achievable protection to wildlife and habitats from any contamination that has taken place. Mike talked a little bit about that, and Paul did as well. We want to minimize the injuries to wildlife and habitats, or injuring wildlife during the cleanup operations, particularly during the collection. You want to be able to provide the best care and capture to these animals to give them the best opportunity to survive from this impact. You have to document all that information so that we can use that in the lessons learned down the road. As you saw from what Mike spoke about, there was a lot of information about the research that's gone into improving what we're doing, and that comes from these lessons learned. And as Paul had mentioned, and I'll show in another slide coming up, that there are typically large groups or several groups that are part of the wildlife branch. You have reconnaissance, you're able to find where the wildlife is, hazing or deterring wildlife to keep them, wildlife that hasn't been impacted yet, out of the area where the cleanup is taking place. Because if you can keep them away and they don't get oiled in the first place, we don't have to worry about cleaning them. Recovery, which is collecting the animals that have been impacted. And then there's the stabilization in the field, and then the care and processing that takes place as we move along. This is an example organizational chart. As you see at the top, the wildlife branch director, and this falls into the previous slide that I showed where with the operations group. Typically, ExxonMobil will have a representative either as the wildlife branch director or the deputy. And that somewhat depends on the area we're working in. Typically California, they take the lead here, and I think the state of Washington as well. But in many other cases, it's somebody from our company. Most of the other positions are going to be filled by the experts. Mike's organization, OWCN, International Bird Rescue, all of those people will come in because they have the staff and the volunteers that are trained in actually handling and rehabilitating the wildlife. And then it's just part of the wildlife branch director or the deputy to be able to manage all of that. So again, planning for wildlife operations is important to wildlife response. Again, you've seen the organizational structure that is important. There's necessary resources. In one of Paul's slides, he talked about the equipment that OSRL has. They have some equipment ready to go for that initial response, and most of the Gowers organizations will also have equipment necessary. There's the nets and cages. You saw some of the images that took place, all of the cleaning, and as you see in the TV commercials, the Dawn dish detergent. All of that stuff, those are the necessary resources that you need in order to provide a good wildlife response. Then there's the funding mechanism, and that comes out of the wildlife, the finance section, because it's all got to be covered. Another thing that, and I don't know it was touched on before, but there's the necessary permitting and approvals, because in order to do any work, at least in North America, to do any work with the animals, you have to have permits to be able to do it. You have to be certified. You have to be trained. We can't, you can't just, the general public can't just go out there and collect an animal and clean it and expect it to all go well. You saw from Mike's presentation that a lot of that is very detailed. It's, there's a lot of information that goes into caring for these animals properly. And then there are the response procedures, and Paul touched on it as well, where you have the primary and secondary procedures. Those are the field components, where the crews are out there collecting the animals or hazing the animals, etc. And then you've got the tertiary procedures, which are basically the components that take place in the facility. So, wildlife response types, those primary responses, that's the oil recovery and the countermeasures, planning and reconnaissance, carcass collection. It's important to collect even the animals that have died, because if they are covered in oil, they become a food source for other predators. Now you've got animals coming in and potentially getting oiled because they were feeding on, a free meal, essentially. And then we want to be able to minimize our disturbance. The habitats are already impacted to some extent. Having people trample around in a marsh, disturbs the environment even more. And then you've got your secondary response. So you have the deterrence or the preemptive capture. In some cases, if if it's a spill, say off the coast, and they've done this down in South Africa, where it was going to impact a penguin colony. So they got permission to preemptively capture the penguins that had not been impacted yet and move them several hundred miles away and release them, because knowing full well they were going to come back to where they were taken from, because that's just what they do. They migrate that way. but by the time they got back, the oil spill had been cleaned up and they weren't impacted. And if you can do that, again, that saves animals from having to go through the stress of being oiled. And then when you get into the tertiary response, so now you've got the full-blown response that includes the recovery and the field stabilization. Before they bring animals into the rehab facility, you want to stabilize them, make sure that they can undergo the stress of being treated. And then you've got a pre-wash period where, and Mike, I believe, talked about some of this, you know, that they get the heaviest oil off first, and then work on bringing them in and processing them, and then going through the actual cleaning process. And then once they're cleaned, they have to be conditioned. Their water resiliency, their waterproofing has to be brought back up before they can be released. You know, Mike showed a slide of those two water birds. One, you can see that they were, you know, losing heat through the head. That's because their waterproofing and their insulation hadn't been conditioned completely yet. And then eventually the animals get released back into the wild, and that's a big thing. They have to be healthy enough to do that, and it's also a nice feel good for the people who spent all this effort on getting them healthy enough to get back into the environment. So touching back onto the preparedness wheel that Paul had shown, you know, pre-planning for wildlife response is really important. You know, why would you want to pre-plan for something that you hope never happens? So that when it does happen, you're already ahead of the game. It helps, you know, by developing these response plans. It helps to engage the subject matter experts within our company, like myself or Rich Woods, as well as others in the network. You know, I've been working for the last 10 years with the different organizations within Gowers to be able to help standardize things, and that really helps our company respond. And then we work with other industry representatives as well. And then we've taken this off to the other non-government organizations and government agencies to educate them on the process of wildlife response and how we prioritize things. So once we get this preparedness going, then it's important for us to get into the training. So engaging in these training and exercises, and I'll cover some of the exercise stuff in some subsequent slides. But we have training, workshops. SEALARM and OSRL have conducted workshops, as has all the representatives of Gowers. They bring people in and train them to how to develop these response capabilities, and then they test the response plans to see where there may be holes in them. And this way we can rework them and fix them as they go along. And identify needs for improvement. That's important, and that's why it's important to have these things tested in our exercises and drills. And then as we get through this cycle, we want to update these plans, and then we run through it again. We work through the preparedness part, we train on it, and we improve, because there's always a need for improvement. So then, Paul had talked about a little bit about Gowers, the Global Oil Wildlife Response System, and as part of that, we had those 10 leading organizations on wildlife response involved. There were also industry members, from all of the major oil companies, and we had an industry advisory group, and we worked as a liaison from the industry to the Gowers members to work on a shared preparedness. What it was we needed as an industry and what they needed as responders, so that we could work with each other. Well, what grew out of that, as we moved into the phase where the Gowers the network is to become an operation or a service within OSRL, we decided to expand that and create this wildlife community of practice. And that's made up of the original members of the industry advisory group, and we've opened it up to more members. And what we did with this was we developed this to create a forum for sharing knowledge and experience. We all have had some experience or some level of experience in actual responses, and each one is different. The same with exercises. And being able to share these experiences and lessons learned help our co-industry members how to respond down the road. And it helps to standardize responses from our side. So if we can do that and share these experiences, we can then help to develop these things to a better and more successful response for not only us as an industry, but the communities that we work in and operate in, and develop these things not only for tier 3 technical specialists, but also for the more localized tier 1 and tier 2 issues. So, but by doing this and creating this forum and having it be a little bit less stringent, it gives some of the members and the attendees to these meetings that we have a little bit more comfort in being able to share the experiences that they have, because it's a little less formal. And we meet quarterly, which is great, and we share these things. The members have shared where wildlife response was integrated into their operations. And again, this informal format helps to facilitate discussion. So where we are putting this into practice, in North America, wildlife response is much more integrated into the response phase. It's whether it's because we have had more opportunity, or that's where things like OPA 90 after the Exxon Valdez and then Deepwater Horizon, there has been a strong push in North America to integrate this. Here, this was an actual response. This was ExxonMobil in Mayflower, Arkansas in 2013. A residential area was impacted. You can see in the lower image there the path or the area of impacted habitat. It was a marsh wetland area, and thankfully there was a local volunteer fire company that was able to respond very quickly and prevented a more significant incident than was already occurred by their quick actions, and it kept oil out of a very large lake that was just to the north, or the upper part of that image that's on the lower left. Because things are integrated so well in the U.S., we had a wildlife response organization from Texas respond within a day or two, and the center picture there shows the beginnings of the wildlife rehab facility. So it doesn't have to be a large facility to do this. It can be a small one. We had to deal with not just birds. I know Mike talked mostly about birds, and that's where the primary research has been. But we had to deal with snakes and turtles and lots of other critters. We did have a beaver that was impacted, and that beaver was rehabilitated and released back into the wild. When you get into the issues of hazing and deterring birds or animals from getting impacted, the image on the lower right was a culvert that the swallows were nesting in. So we had to keep them from getting in there because it was a bit of a confined space. There were fumes from the crude oil that had spilled. So in order to keep them from being impacted, once they left the space for the day, we put up netting to prevent them from getting back in there. And of course, because that was considered a hazing, we needed a federal permit to be able to do that. So this is just one of the many, or not many, but one of the incidents that we had to deal with, that we've been able to share this information. And because we were prepared with how we put plans together and who we work with, we have been able to we were able to respond a whole lot quicker than if we had not taken the time to work our plans. Again, putting more of this into practice, this is an exercise that ExxonMobil had put together. This was in Malaysia. And the important thing about this was we were working our emergency response plan, but this was the first time that members or representatives of Gowers were first involved in an exercise with us. And we had OSRL, our Tier 3 response organization, and Sea Alarm also involved in this, and they provided a wildlife training and some demonstrations on how to respond. And it was really important that our response team got to see that. And you can see in the bottom right, our own Dr. Mike Ziccardi, who participated in the training that they had put together. The important thing here is in Malaysia, there's not as an extensive wildlife rehabilitation network as there is, say, in North America or even in Europe for that matter. So it was important to be able to identify local resources. And that's where having the Gowers Network and the assessment team available helps to do that. And they have such an extensive worldwide network that we were able to identify a turtle conservation center that could be used in the event of a spill. And then the last case study that I've shared with our community of practice was in 2021. Our company put together a global exercise. It was the first one we've ever done. Typically, we do them in the regions. We had a global exercise, took 3 regional response teams, started in our Asia Pacific area, out in working the issue out in Thailand. And then from there, as they started the initial response, they handed it off to our Europe, Africa, Middle East team, who continued to work the wildlife response plan and other response plans that we had. And then that was handed off to the Americas team for basically based in Houston. And then once we finalized everything, we passed it back to Asia Pacific. The importance here, as far as the planning and the preparation goes, is we've put together templates for the initial response. And in the past, 10 years ago, this sort of exercise would have taken us several days just to get the response plan put together. And we were able to do this in the first 28 hours, which was an excellent undertaking. So to wrap this all up, and I know this has been a lot of information for everyone to have to take in, to bring these 3 together. Wildlife response, as Mike showed, very complex. It's driven by species and age classes affected. The products spilled, lighter products versus heavier products are going to cause all kinds of different issues. And then the available resources, as you can see by where things would occur globally. Wildlife response has advanced over the years. Research and cooperation amongst the leading organizations has improved tremendously. And the development of internationally agreed upon standards of care means that the response organizations are all working off the same script, and they can share personnel and aid each other, as took place recently down in Peru with the spill. There were several of the members of Gowers involved, and because they all have shared and worked on these standards together, they've been able to put together a good response. So Gowers was formed because of the sharing of knowledge and resources and experience. It's an international framework for oiled wildlife response, and it's already proven itself. Wildlife response It's scalable and flexible, as I showed you in the pictures here. Tiered preparedness is important, as Paul talked about. You know, sometimes it's not necessarily how big the spill is, but how many resources you have to bring in. And as we've extended our Gowers network, the Wildlife Community of Practice is helping industry share our lessons learned. And with this webinar that Tim and Lynn have put together, it gives us the opportunity to be able to share this with so many more people that we may or may not be able to do normally at a conference. So, and what's next? Before we get into questions, in June we have a meeting to bring the Gowers network hopefully to more people in Amsterdam at Interspill. And then also in late September, we're going to have an Effects of Oil on Wildlife conference that is jointly sponsored by, I believe, International Bird Rescue and Ayuca out of Brazil. And that will be in Long Beach, California, again, in late September. So, and with that, I will stop my sharing.
Okay. Hey, thanks, guys. We went a little bit long, but what I asked the presenters to do is to go into the question and answer screen and answer some of the questions, and then they left 4 of them that we can try to go through. I can stay a little bit after, and we still have a number of people that are still online. So great. And I have to tell you guys, there's been more questions from this talk, these sets of talks than we've had in the past. I think that's to the quality of it and the interest that people have. I have kind of one question before we go into so I'll take the host prerogative here. You know, I know there's always this concern about what's the greater good, and you know, we do. You know, pharmaceutical companies use live animals to test their products. Even cosmetic companies use live animals to test their products. But it looks like the study, Michael, the studies that you talked about are all based on real events. Is there no work to take, you know, some surrogate species that it is possible to do, you know, oiling experiments, cleaning experiments, and then survival experiments to help increase or enhance the protocols faster than waiting for the next spill to try to improve things? Is that just out of the question?
No, it's not out of the question at all. We do experimental exposure studies interspersed with studies during incidents. In fact, the dispersant study that I mentioned was done on common MERS that were captured, brought into captivity, exposed. We're currently doing some work, funding some work and doing some work right now on amphibians as well, to kind of see overarching impacts, not only how best to clean, but then also doing some mortality studies and seeing how oil might be absorbed in those groups as well. So it is a mix. Obviously, we try to minimize that as much as possible, and if there are ways to avoid the confounders that might occur during live exposures during spills, we do. But if the questions are important enough, we definitely can rely on surrogate species or other groups.
Okay. What about hazing? I mean, I know we have challenges with hazing in some of our facilities, and these animals, the wildlife gets immune to something that you'd think they wouldn't get immune to relatively quickly. So it seems like that's a pretty big area where there's a lot of room for improvement. Is that stuff that you're involved with, or are there groups that are looking at hazing in particular and how to enhance their capabilities and keeping birds out of the oil slicks to begin with, right?
Rich Woods and I have been working with some organizations, but yeah, as you said, birds and animals in general get habituated, you know, pretty quickly to scarecrows or scare tactics. So you have to use multiple different efforts. I think one of the latest things that we're going to explore with, I believe with Curl, would be the use of lasers. They have that, there's a technology out there to do that. But it's, and Mike and Paul have probably had just as much experience with these different things. You have to keep switching it up because the animals just get habituated so easily.
Yeah, we've funded some work looking at different technologies. In fact, even the use of potentially the use of drones to actually not only directly haze animals, but then also bring auditory hazing techniques in. A lot of the work that's done out there is actually done by Wildlife Services, USDA, APHIS, and some of the airports as well, because they have a drastic need to improve that. So we tend to collect information wherever it might occur, but it absolutely is a need, Tim.
Hey, let me mention something before we go on to the questions. We have this remotely controlled jet ski that has a tethered UAV on it, and it also has a radar system on it that we've tested, and it can spot migrating birds from long distances away. And the idea with it is, we haven't done a lot of research in it, but the idea is that thing can be kind of autonomous and use its radar system to keep birds from landing in areas where we don't land them to. So if there's a group that, and it's something that we haven't really put a lot of funding into just because we got other things on my plate at least, but if there's a group that might be interested in it, I think that system with its radar system and then the tethered UAV and just the movement of that jet ski by itself, right, it would move into the path. It would automatically move into the path of any organism, and there's nobody on it, right? So you could go through oil slicks and everything else. And probably the movement of that boat would keep of the jet ski, and it could have its own sound system on it to keep things from happening. But that might be a pretty slick way of doing hazing as well. So if there's a group that might be interested in that technology, we have prototypes built actually for other reasons, but I think it can be easily adapted to that reason. You guys have probably looked through the questions. I can start from the top, or do you see some that we should kind of go through first? I see the question.
Well, I know looking at some of these before, Mike and Paul were answering questions while I was talking. But
Yeah,
John Monday had a question that's in the open section that maybe Mike can answer.
Sure. I can paraphrase the question for time. It's basically the value of doing this if survivability is low, especially compared to natural survivability. And it's a really important question. And it's one that, it does go towards, the heart of the question is what is the value of oil wildlife response? And it's a question that comes up every single spill. It's one of the reasons why in some of our more recent studies we're incorporating more control groups and comparison groups to try to tease apart the effects of oil, the effects of rehabilitation, etc. So there are questions we address. We think there's value in it, and even if it is a common species we're looking at, those data can be applied to threatened or endangered species where in each individual is critically important to the species as a whole. So we do want to put the best science forward to really answer those questions.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next one. Maybe we can get through these. How detailed a plan should be in the tertiary response? It should detail the rehabilitation and the release, or should it stop some steps earlier? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Maybe I'll start that one, and Richard and Mike can chime in. I mean, I think Richard did a good job of just explaining, I think, just the number of operational steps involved in the tertiary response. So it's really, the most involved aspect of the response. And I think in terms of planning, it's certainly really helpful to really detail that, to really understand the capabilities that are required, the way those are going to be integrated into the management system. And I think if you're looking at that journey all the way through to release, obviously to do that pre-planning work, even understanding any sort of permitting process in terms of releasing animals, any sort of particular challenges in doing so, how decisions are going to be made around release sites, etc. So I think there is an ability to really include elements of that whole process in the plan, and then of course hopefully maintaining that flexibility so that the elements of that plan can then be applied to a specific incident, and the flexibility of how that's applied. But certainly I think there's a value in really going through that whole process and making sure that is referenced in the plan. Rich, Mike, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
That's great.
Other than well, you're not sure what animals you're going to come across in, I guess, the original plan, but your plan should at least include what the criteria are for releasing those animals, what's considered healthy, because you don't want to just release them because you think they're clean. They need to be healthy enough. You also have to determine, depending on how long it takes to do that, if you're releasing them back into the environment at the wrong period of time. I know in the spill in New Zealand, they had birds that were there for a while. They had to hold on to them longer because they would have released them at the wrong time of year, which would have impacted their survivability.
Okay, great. Let's go to the next one here. To what extent does or can wildlife response teams offer advice to the incident command system on response methods, right? Do you think you have a role in suggesting one response method over another to avoid making things worse? Any thoughts on that?
I think absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why people involved in wildlife response, since we tend to straddle between ops and planning, as Rich mentioned. So talk about the Harlequin vest, where you got blue on one side and red on the other as far as an operational element, in that really the people that are involved in tertiary response and secondary response really need to be part of the plans that are developed to make sure that the strategies and tactics that are developed, that there is consideration taken to how that might negatively impact species. That happened in Macondo, where controlled burns and chemical dispersants were used. And so, but we were able to come over and really talk about how those technologies, different techniques to avoid negative impacts, at least to marine mammals, sea turtles, and flocks of birds. So just by having go, no go criteria, having observers out there to make sure animals were not impacted before that, it didn't interfere with operational tempo, but it was just a double check to make sure animals weren't at risk.
Great. We got messages on. There's a comment here. IOL has a bird hazing program. They run continuously in the tailings ponds up in Curl.
Yeah, I believe they looked at using the robotic dog as a deterrent method.
Okay, and maybe we got one more. Okay, in addition to ethical need to respond to oiled wildlife, we have both legal drivers. NCP is explicit, as well as a health and safety driver. We've seen repeatedly that if professionals don't address oiled wildlife, the public will, at increased risk themselves. So that's a comment. That's a good comment, actually.
I think that's a great point, and I think it speaks to, there's many reasons for planning. The Bojabil spill that I showed the picture of from the Netherlands, that was something that was really identified as a risk to human safety, was the fact that you had members of the public spontaneously sort of trying to intervene. And obviously, the more that folks are looking at this online or on the news, and they're not seeing that coordinated response effort, that there's a risk of obviously, people getting involved and taking it into their own hands. So certainly, I think the human safety, as well as just providing the best animal care, is another really excellent reason for really putting some investment into pre-planning.
Yep. Hey, before I let you guys go, I have one question that's from kind of my job is trying to increase and enhance our capabilities for response in general. And I think about, going after the thick oil, and getting it off the surface as quickly as possible in one way or another. And then, that keeps the oil from weathering and becoming more and more persistent. But I can see there's a spectrum here of kind of fresh oil has a certain amount of challenges with it, as far as toxicity of the components, but as it starts to weather and becomes emulsified, it becomes stickier, but then it can go beyond and become really a tar ball and be less sticky. And then there's the spectrum to the challenges from the sheens, right? So we focus on where the bulk of the oil is, which is the thick oil, and try to, how do we enhance our response capabilities to get that thick oil to the water? I wonder if there's research on both of those things, that the weathering of the oil, right? Is it important to get the oil as soon as possible, or can it weather into something that is less damaging? Because it's mostly physical contact to these surface dwelling wildlife. And then is there any research that shows at some point can these birds and marine mammals and turtles, can they handle a certain amount of sheen? And if they get oiled with a very thin film of sheen, should that organism be allowed to kind of do what it needs to do to survive? Because I know there's natural oil seeps, and there's natural sheens that come to the surface that are biologic as well. So you'd think that there would be at some point, many of these organisms have the natural capability to resolve these kinds of problems. So 2 questions: is the weathering state of the oil, is there at some point where the oil becomes less of a kind of a physical challenge to these organisms? And then is there a point where a sheen becomes thin enough that some contact with that sheen is survivable? Do we know either of those things?
Great questions. We don't know a lot about. I think as far as the weathering, I think again, Barataria Bay dolphins have shown us that acute oil, if the volatiles are there and you have animals that are explosive breathers at the surface like dolphins, they can get a significant exposure through that. And so decrease of the volatility of that is going to decrease potential impact as far as absorption. They do get droplets as well, but we're at this point thinking it's more of the volatile impacts. As far as it becoming more weathered, yes, you're right. As far as external exposure, the less sticky an oil is, the less likely it's going to have penetration into fur and feathers for those species. But we still get animals that come ashore in California every year with tar balls on them, and they're negatively impacted due to those. So even oil that is fairly heavily weathered can have impacts. As far as how thick of a sheen can affect it, I am unaware of any research on that. We've thought about it. We've thought about the different types of sheens, the different thicknesses, and how that might affect penetration. I don't know of any research out there that's there.
Yeah, it seems like that's an important thing to understand, because during Macondo, most of the water surface is covered with sheen, if it was covered, and not thick oil. So can a bird, land in that and spend some time and then come out? It seems like that might be a study for some of these surrogates, right? You could do exposure studies with, when should we be very active on the type of, or the thickness of the oil that these organisms encounter, and when can we let them fend for themselves and they'll survive? I think that's an important question. Okay, well, listen. Did we get some more questions? We still have 45 people listening. Is there another question here that I missed? Looks like something. Michael spoke to the science of oil spills. We do experience challenges to our science, sometimes to the extent that it seems like our advances in knowledge are not accepted or recognized. Can we improve this by identifying, 1, what we know, and 2, what we don't know but could learn with more study, and 3, what things are not knowable, and go from there? Is that
the known knowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns? Yeah. We have that conversation all the time within our scientific advisory committee. It's an important question, and we're trying to figure it out. The known unknowns is where we can focus on, really, to really kind of similar to what you mentioned, Tim, as far as what sheens are the most concerning, because that then it applies to cleanup technologies. That's one of the reasons why we do a competitive grant program, and we set some criteria, that things that we would like to explore, But then we encourage any researchers out there that are interested in exploring these and have great ideas to submit it, and we have funding to be able to support that.
Okay, looks like one last question. If I get through it quick, nobody else can write something. But so is reducing the volatiles in the floating oil through the use, somebody wrote another question. Through the use of dispersants, a trade-off to consider for marine mammals given the extensive adverse effect. I mean, my thought on that is the quicker we can get the oil off the surface, the less chance that an organism is going to have a surface dwelling organism, right? It's always a trade-off decision because you guys you're not catching fish and de-oiling fish, but fish can be impacted from oil in the water column as well. So everything's a trade-off decision, but speed is the focus we have from a response side is speed. And things that can encounter oil and treat it and get it off the surface quick, in my opinion, is going to be more protective of these organisms that are, that spend their time on the surface of the water. So you have any thoughts on that?
For air breathing vertebrates, absolutely. I guess the question then is those animals in the water column, as you mentioned.
Right, it's always a trade-off.
We're trying to figure out.
Okay, one last. We brought up the issue with biosecurity with HPAI currently present in domestic and wildlife. Is that the bird flu or something? In domestic and wildlife, wild bird populations, are there discussions on best practice evolving from the domestic animal environment? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, there definitely have been amongst the Gowers members. Paul or Mike can talk about the issues that took place down in South Africa earlier this year because of stuff like that. But yeah, that's the one of the good parts about this network is the sharing of that information.
Yeah, Mike's probably got some good things to say here. I think I mentioned this to Ryan in the chat before, but I think that the key thing here is it could severely impact some of the preferred response operations, the ability to use existing facilities that might have other populations. So it's really a key factor and definitely one to consider and plan for as best as possible. In terms of sharing practice, as Rich said, there's been a lot of sharing amongst the different organizations of just experiences of doing this. Mike, I don't know if there's sort of an evolution there in terms of best practices that are coming from the domestic animal environment, but anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, we've definitely talked about it within the Gowers team. We are following closely, at least here in the US, the organizations that are here, we're following what USDA and the AZA is putting out. The other issue, in addition to altering our response tempo, is also the potential for human health and safety, because avian influenza viruses are potentially zoonotic. It is a potential, and as we are very well aware, viruses can alter and mutate based on our COVID-19 experience. So they are things to take into consideration. It may very well change how we operate.
Okay, great. We're getting more questions. I'm seeing this one by are stupefying agents still recommended for use? What is that? I have no idea what that means. Does somebody know what a stupefying agent is?
I think Ed was
the bird or
yeah.
I
think Ed was meaning as far as anesthetic agents or etc. Because of the we can use them, but we tend to not, only because those types of agents tend to affect the ability to maintain normal body temperature, and for oiled animals it does negatively affect their ability to maintain homeothermia. So you have an animal that already gets too hot or too cold, and you add something that can increase that.
Yeah.
It's kind of a last ditch effort.
Yep, understood. Okay, guys, we've gone we've gone longer than we have in the past. So once again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time. We did get through all the questions. If anybody's still on, I think these three guys will be happy to answer other questions offline if you want to contact them as well. I'm going to hit the pause, stop record button